My last Halloween. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday. It was the one time of the year you could be anything you wanted to be. You could draw out your darkest desires and display them for the world to see. No one would think you were odd for being the person you always wanted to be. There was no judgment for your choice of attire, and oftentimes you were commended for that choice. Then at the end of the night, you received a reward for your efforts in the form of a bag full of candy. I am far too old to go door to door begging for treats, but I enjoy watching my children do the same. Weeks in advance, we let them pick their costumes. They are far too young to delve into the ghastly and usually end up picking a character of a popular movie or TV show. I simply take my pictures and urge them onto each doorway. I always remind them to say trick or treat before the door opens. It has been this way for a few years now, but I'm starting to question the tradition, especially after visiting 113 Forest Road. This past year, we made the rounds of our local neighborhood. We made sure to only approach homes that had their porch light on, which was the unspoken rule. Our night had almost come to an end when we reached a home that had been vacant for the last 2 seasons. It was the largest within our neighborhood, towering at 2 stories when all others only had 1 level. It was a large brick Victorian monstrosity that may have once been beautiful, but the landscape had long needed work. It was the house most kids made stories about, and when we saw the dim glow of that yellow bulb, I was unsure of letting my children approach. My oldest begged to ring the doorbell, and my youngest simply wanted more candy. I was outnumbered and relented at their pleas. My wife sat within the idling vehicle while I followed close behind. The 2 made their way up the steps and I waited at the bottom. Like always, I reminded them of what to say. My oldest son held his brother's hand and pressed the lighted button. Ringing, much like church bells, echoed from within the house for a moment before returning to silence. After a few seconds, they turned to me with questioning looks. I had noticed a moving truck parked outside the home earlier in the month and knew someone must live there, but I had not seen them. There was no car in the driveway, and I did not see any lights on inside. I started to think they were simply gone and left the light on in case it was dark by the time they returned. I waved to my children to come back to the car and told them we would just head home. The look of disappointment on their faces told me they were not ready to end the night just yet. Their faces lit up as the door creaked to life and a voice beckoned them to wait. Trick or treat, they both screamed with excitement. A feeling rolled in me like thunder and a signal of danger rang in my head. Something was not right. If they were home all this time, where was the car I'd seen in the driveway the last few weeks? I instinctively advanced on my 2 children, taking the steps in leaps. A feeling inside told me they should not go toward that voice, and I called for them to stop as they turned toward the door. I choose both. The voice seemed strained, like that of a lifetime smoker. 2 ragged hands shot from the parted pathway and drew both my little boys inside. Their screams echoed in my head. My adrenaline shot me forward, but my body slammed against a closing door. I pounded repeatedly, screaming obscenities of every nature. My body shook violently as my world became a spiral of despair. The whole scene drew the attention of my wife, and soon she was right behind me. In an effort to find the entry, I took a step back, lifted my right foot, and dropped it full force into the hardwood. The doorframe shattered, allowing the barrier to fly freely into the darkness. I cried out in terror for my little boys as I rushed through each room. My entire reason for living had been snatched up in an instant, and I had been too late to stop it. When the house had been searched completely, with no results, my wife phoned the authorities through wails of agony. We both held each other until sirens lit up our tiny neighborhood. It has been a year now, and we still have no answer as to what happened to our children. My wife distanced herself from me, and I'm sure she blames me for what happened. I I don't fault her for that. I blame myself as well. If I had not let them go to that door or listened to my feelings sooner, they would both still be here. Halloween is no longer a time of fun for us, but a reminder of our mistakes. I don't even leave my house on that night, and even the sight of a pumpkin makes tears stream down my face. The drive home from work is especially hard, witnessing the houses that decorate for the occasion. I am almost in a panic before I close myself within the safety of my home. Please, if you read this, don't let your kids visit 113 Forest Road on Halloween. From hell I write. I write to you now, but I do not write from my room, with a bed so soft and a window so bright. I do not write from my home, with couches so comfortable and food so good. Oh, food, how I miss it. Water, too. If I could get one drop, oh, how I would thank God. Well, I'd thank someone for it anyway. I do not write from my treehouse, among friends so dear and chirping birds so near. I do not write even from the world you live in right now. No, I write from a place much, much worse. It's ironic because during my last moments in the world, I couldn't imagine any sort of place worse than the place we call Earth. I thought such a place couldn't possibly exist. How wrong I was. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Patrick, and for you to understand my train of thought, I'll need to take you back a little. Back to the world God, your God, no longer mine, put me on. Oh, the 80s. What a time to be alive. Great movies, great music, somewhat. Great friends, great family, great house, great life, great... Sorry, I'm rambling. 11 years old, that was me. Living in a suburban home with my mother, Sarah, my dad, Vincent, my asshole 13-year-old twin brothers, Darren and Bryce, and, of course, my 5-year-old sister, Nancy. Come to think of it, I wonder how she's doing right now. Sweet little Nancy. She was always so precious, so innocent. I hope what we went through together never changed that. Anyhow, I can remember the day so clearly. I was playing a basketball game of 2-on-1. I was the one, with Darren and Bryce. The two jerks were creaming me, of course, never hasting to shove me around and taunt me. Patrick, you're an ass at this, they would say. Well, of course I was ass. I was an 11-year-old playing 2-on-1 against two 13-year-old pricks. Actually, you know something? I'm gonna stop calling them names. See, when you're on Earth, it's easy to call your family members names and quarrel with them constantly. Where I am now, though, you'd give anything just to hug them for 5 seconds and tell them how much you love them. Oops, I'm rambling again. Well, soon enough, our mother called us in as we were having some guests over that night. Our new neighbors. The new neighbors in question were the Hofmeister family. Up to that point, all I had heard my brother say about them were things like they're creepy as shit and weird-ass people who gotta go. I didn't share these opinions. They seemed like okay people to me. Nonetheless, the Hofmeisters came over that night. The family consisted of 3. First, there was a 60-year-old Eileen, a skinny woman with short gray hair, always wearing black dresses. Next, we had none other than 60-something-year-old Leo. Don't really remember that bastard's age, nor do I care. Also, extremely thin, with a long nose that would make the pasty white guy on the Pink Panther show jealous. Then there was David, their 11-year-old, insecure adopted son. I'm pretty sure Leo and David are in the same place I'm writing from now, but I'm not certain. See, we don't really get to speak with anyone else here. Anyways, it was quite an eventful evening. Eileen and Leo had tea with my parents while Darren, Bryce, David, and I hung out in our treehouse playing cards. In the treehouse, I started to get to know David a little better. I must say, though, he seemed a bit on the weird side. He was pretty awkward when it came to discussing things such as where he moved from or what life at home was like. Still, he was a nice kid, just very shy. Later that night, when the sun went down, my brothers had already gone home, and David and I were walking down our street lamp-lit road. That's when he invited me over to his house for a bit. It was a Friday night, so I figured it'd be okay. Let me say this, his house was big. It was the biggest in the neighborhood, down at the end of my street, sitting high on a hilltop as if it were better than all the others. Behind it was a large field that eventually merged into some woods, which lined the horizon. Entering David's house, we walked into his kitchen, where he told me to take my shoes off as to not upset his parents. I heard some footsteps upstairs, so I figured his parents must have gotten back from my house. We sat down at his counter, eating yogurt. David continued to dodge my questions about his home life, or just his life in general. All I knew was that he was adopted. Soon enough, I heard Eileen upstairs. "David, come upstairs, please," she said. David told me to stay put, as he'd only be a minute, and just like that, he was gone. I sat alone in their kitchen, finishing off my yogurt cup. I decided to get up and look around a bit and to keep myself busy while David was upstairs doing whatever the hell he was doing. Looking at the fridge, I got a look at some of the pictures that were magnetized to it. These included family photos with grinning faces of Eileen and Leo and the frowning face of David. Why did David look so unhappy in all these photos? Oh, and another thing. There was a photo on their fridge of some kid sitting on the floor of what looked like a cellar, just staring up at the camera with a blank face. Strange. I then walked over to a shelf in their living room, which was stacked with framed photos and figurines. Lots of self-portraits here, including one of Eileen, her expression blank, eyes looking very cold and lifeless. For some reason, it kind of reminded me of this portrait I'd once seen of the family cowboy named Buffalo Bill. Same sort of stare and expression and whatnot. Anyway, sorry, I don't even know why that came to mind. I started looking at some of the figurines on the shelf. A Mickey Mouse doll, a monkey doll, this creeped me out, and a pentagram necklace. Oh, and there was also a crucifix necklace, but the cross was upside down. What idiot messed that up, I thought to myself. I then realized that David had been gone for a while, and while I was getting a little bored with looking at people's decorations, I decided to go upstairs and find him. Walking up the stairs, I began to hear some weird noises coming from one of the rooms. It sounded like chanting, and as I got to the top of the stairs, I confirmed that it was. I looked down the upstairs hallway of the Hofmeister home and saw that one of the rooms had a light on inside, the door open just a crack. As I walked toward the door, I could clearly hear Eileen and Leo chanting in some weird language I'd never heard before. I slowly crept toward the room, a decision I regret to this day. I pushed the door open slightly, just enough to see Eileen and Leo on the floor, on their hands and knees, bowing down to something that was just out of my view. I didn't dare open the door any wider than I already had, even if it meant satisfying my curiosity to see what in blazes they were bowing down to. From my point of view, I could see a small cauldron filled with a steamy liquid. Leo was blowing cigar smoke and spitting rum into this bowl. The whole atmosphere in the room was different. I don't really know how to describe it. It was like I could feel the presence of someone else in there, but I couldn't see them. Then I saw David in the back corner of the room, curled up in the fetal position, bawling his eyes out. He looked more terrified than anyone I'd ever seen, up to that point, and now it's a different story. David's terror only grew when his mother, if you want to call that awful witch such a thing, stormed over to his corner of the room and grabbed him by the wrist, pulling him up off the ground in an attempt to get him to bow down to whatever they were bowing to. I could see his fear grow when he watched Leo pull a rooster out of a burlap sack and chop its head off in a brutal animal sacrifice. Then his face went white with horror as he realized how much trouble he was in when piss began running down his leg and onto the floor. That did it. Eileen began slapping David over and over again, angrily screaming at him. "You never, never, never do that in front of the beast," she screamed. The beating eventually stopped, and David was just a heaping mess and a puddle of his own tears and piss. This was when I decided that it was a good idea to get the hell out. I turned to exit, but in my haste, I knocked over one of their many picture frames that lined a desk upstairs. I winced when this happened, knowing that it was about a 99.99% probability that the devious couple down the hall heard it. I rushed down the stairs as quick as I could, nearly tripping myself. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. Still, poor David. I wished I could have done something to help. Grabbing the door handle, I prepared to make a hasty exit out the front door of that dreaded house. Then I stopped dead in my tracks. Holy shit, please tell me. Yep, my shoes were still in the kitchen. I ran for dear life toward the kitchen, locking onto my shoes like a missile. I grabbed them. Yes. Hello, Patrick. No. I looked up to see Eileen standing on the upstairs balcony, looking down over me with an overly friendly expression on her face. I was frozen in place. Do I run? No, that will just look stupid. Also, she'll know that I saw what those creeps were doing up there. Hey, I managed to utter out. I didn't realize you were still here, said Eileen in a much too friendly manner. Oh yeah, sorry, I said. No need to apologize, she said, but it is getting quite late. You should go home. Don't need your parents coming over here now, do we? No, we don't, I thought to myself. I managed to stammer out some stupid reply before saying goodbye and rushing to their front door, bursting out of it. I'm never going back there, I thought to myself. If only that were true. As I ran home, I looked back at the house, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. In one of the bedroom windows was Eileen, just standing there, staring at me. When she saw me look, she raised her hand and waved. That was it. She knew what I saw. Damn it. Well, I ran home as fast as my feet could take me. I immediately told my brothers, told them about the beatings, the chanting, the cauldron, and Eileen repeatedly addressing someone, or something, in the room by the names The Beast and Lucifer. Well, my stupid brothers proceeded to spread the story around the whole entire school until everyone knew. Everybody knew that David's parents were the freaky witches at the end of the street. Exaggerated and blown out of proportion, the story spread like wildfire. David refused to talk to me, knowing it had to have been me who spread the rumors. I felt horrible for him, but I didn't know what to do. I was too afraid to get the police or child services after what I saw in that house. I was too young to know that was what I had to do, and that it was not a choice. I tried to push the whole thing into the back of my mind. That was until Halloween night, a few weeks later. Good old All Hallows Eve. It was one of my favorite holidays ever. That Halloween night, I was doing what every kid should be doing, trying to pack as much candy as humanly possible into one pillowcase in one night. My friends and I were trying to hit all the local neighborhoods so we'd be able to mow down candy for months. However, my plans were ruined when we ran into my brothers and their devious loudmouth friends. My brothers took me aside and told me I had no choice but to show them the window of the room I had seen the Hoffmisters doing their deeds in. There was no arguing my way out of it, and I soon found myself back at that dreaded place. My brothers, their friends, and I stood in the Hoffmeister's yard on the side of their house. In the driveway were moving trucks. I wasn't surprised. Those people had been humiliated. I was actually really happy these creeps wouldn't be living down the street from where I sleep anymore. My brother, Darren, confirmed that they were moving away because of the rumors. Well, before I knew it, my brothers were forcing me to climb a tree to get a better look into the window on the side of the house. They wanted to see if there was anything batshit crazy that would be visible in it. And of course, being the pushover I was, I climbed that tree. It seemed like all was going well until the light in the window shut off. This was the first sign that something was wrong. However, before I could get down from the tree and tell my brothers to piss off, we all heard the front door open. Of course, my brothers and their friends took off, leaving me up in the tree. Eileen must have heard them because the next thing I knew, she was prowling the side of the house and examining the muddy footprints left by my brothers and their friends. This is it, I thought. I'm gonna accidentally snap a branch or fall or something and she's gonna catch me. But, by some miracle, Eileen didn't see me up in her tree and went inside. Well, I hightailed it out of there, leaving my pirate hat, part of my Halloween costume, lying on the ground in her yard. I never wanted to even look at that damn house again. I sprinted down my street and through my neighborhood, all the way down to the schoolyard where my friends and I agreed we'd meet up after my brother's little scheme. And to my utter dismay, my friends were nowhere to be found. All I could say at that point was that my brothers had better still have my damn candy in their possession. I looked around the schoolyard a bit more. Nothing. Not a sign of my friends. It must have been pretty late at this point. There weren't even trick-or-treaters on the streets anymore. I knew my parents were going to kill me, so I started to head home. A walk home on Halloween night was the coolest thing ever. It was peaceful, spooky, and unsettling, all at the same time. I kind of liked that creepy feeling. It was what gave Halloween its charm. However, I really don't like the feeling of terror. Kind of like the terrifying feeling that came over me when I noticed that I was being followed by Leo Hoffmeister's pickup truck. Great. Behind me were Eileen and Leo. Leo, of course being the lapdog that he was driving. Eileen was sitting in the passenger seat. They knew. They knew I had spread those rumors. Who else could have? No one. I was their only visitor in their new house. I ran as fast as I could down the street, their old blue pickup truck continuing to cruise after me. I eventually veered off the sidewalk and into the woods. I ran faster than I ever had in my life that night. Dashing through the woods, I looked back over my shoulder to see their truck, which was parked on the side of the road next to the woods. Holy shit, I thought. I am dead. These people are nuts. Unfortunately, looking at their truck parked, I did not see the fallen tree trunk in the middle of my path. And, as you probably guessed, I tripped over it, knocking every last bit of air out of my lungs when I hit the ground. I crawled, gasping and wheezing for air, and the next thing I knew, the menacing figure of Eileen was standing over me. She looked so frightening in the moonlight, her gray, stringy hair being illuminated as the rest of her face remained dark and hidden. Even more frightening was when she held out my pirate hat and dropped it into my lap. Great, that was strike two for sticking my nose where it didn't belong, and somehow I got the feeling that I wasn't getting a third. "Oh, Patrick, you took a nasty fall," sneered Eileen. "Let us take you to our new house and take care of you there. We'll make you feel healed and new." I pleaded with her, telling her that I was fine and I needed to be home. Of course, she didn't listen. The witch clutched my wrist and dragged me out of the forest over to their truck. I was dead meat. I was so freaking dead. Well, I would have been if it hadn't been for a passing neighbor, who who caught the two in the act of forcing me into their truck. Eileen and Leo managed to bullshit their way out of the situation before getting in their truck and quickly driving away, leaving me behind. I went home and told my parents about the entire ordeal. The cops were called, yet after several days of searching, they were stumped as to the location of the Hoffmisters. According to them, they weren't at their old house, nor had they been to their new one. No record of apartments or hotel rooms were on file either. Those demon-worshipping, child-abusing scum had vanished off the grid. I was fine with that, and decided to try and get on with my life, hopefully never even having to think about the Hoffmisters again. However, it wasn't long before I began noticing some weird shit going on around my neighborhood. What do I mean by that, you ask? First off, there were a couple of instances where I would see a kid on the street, walking up the road in a trance-like state. And where did they walk to? Why, none other than that damn hill and into the dreaded Hoffmister home. Keep in mind that I was paranoid at the time, and my bedroom window looked right out onto the street, so I was the only one noticing this stuff, at least the only one at my house. I tried telling my parents, but they were just annoyed by it, telling me to quit letting my fears get the best of me. I still haven't forgiven them for it to this day. Then again, all I want right now is to tell them I forgive them. The strange occurrences then began to take an even scarier turn. One night, I woke up to hear the whispering of my little sister, Nancy. I got out of bed to have a look. As I walked down the hall toward her room, I began to make out what she was saying. Things like, uh-huh, and okay, I'll go. I opened her door just in time to see her standing on her knees in bed, staring out the window. However, that wasn't the scary part. The scary part was seeing a scrawny, female shadow being projected onto Nancy's bedroom wall by the moonlight. The second I called out to Nancy, the shadow seemed to scurry off. I rushed over to Nancy, asking her who she was talking to. My little sister hadn't the faintest idea of what I was talking about. I told my parents, and this time my dad jumped out of bed at the prospect of somebody standing outside of Nancy's window. However, he went outside to find no one. Well, I began to run my mouth again. You'd think I would have learned the first time around, to my brothers. Darren and Bryce, along with their friends, started to develop a newfound interest in all this Eileen talk. Something about that creepy place at the end of the street amused them, gave them a rush. They loved that type of stuff. Another thing to know about Darren and Bryce was that they had a knack for sneaking out of the house on Saturday nights, something my parents hated but never really took enough action to prevent. And sure enough, my brothers and their friends snuck out one Saturday night to check out the old Hoffmister house. This time, however, I wouldn't accompany them. But I sure came to know about it, because after my brothers went missing that night, one of their friends, who was smart enough to get out of there early on, told me about it. The police went over to the Hoffmister home, search warrant and all, to investigate. They found nothing there. Nothing. However, as usual, I continued to be the one making the terrifying discoveries. This time, it was a VHS tape that I found sticking out of the VCR in my room one morning. Popping the tape in, the first thing I saw on the TV screen was a static shot of a cellar. The cellar was so dark and dingy looking, almost like a dungeon. Suddenly, the camera began to jiggle around a bit, and whoever was picking it up pointed it at none other than my brother Darren. Darren was tied down to a chair, unconscious, looking bruised, battered, and abused. Boo. The loud yell from the camera person jolted Darren awake. The camera person was Eileen. She began to laugh sickly as Darren came to his senses, immediately beginning to cry. Who the hell would do this to another human being, I thought. That was my brother, too. I watched in horror as she continued to verbally torment Darren, eventually getting physical with him, smacking him in his face, his chest, and eventually his groin area. This woman was a sick, filthy pedophile. It wasn't until I saw Eileen begin to pull a sickle out of her pocket that I shut the tape off. Part of me wanted to go on. I had to know if Darren was dead, but couldn't watch. I couldn't bear to witness my brother get tortured like that. I rushed upstairs to my parents' room, leaving the VHS and the cassette player. However, my parents were gone. They had vanished. Oh shit, I thought. Am I next? Well, when I walked downstairs, I stopped dead in my tracks on the stairwell. My blood ran cold as I noticed Eileen Hoffmister in my room, carefully removing the VHS tape from my VCR with latex gloves. She caught my stare. I swear, the second we made eye contact, my heart skipped a beat. She grinned at me and waved, saying, "I'll be back for you two tonight." And just like that, the witch climbed out of my window and was gone. I rushed to Nancy's bedroom, now frightened out of my wits. Oh, thank God, Nancy was still there. She was sleeping soundly, that is until I woke her up. I ran in screaming and crying, probably scaring the poor girl to death. I didn't tell her about the videotape. I just told the police. That night, our neighbor, Betty, frail old woman, babysat us at our house. No one had a clue where the heck our parents were. Outside of our home were 2 police officers keeping watch over the house. Betty was always a great neighbor, such a nice old lady. The nicest woman you'd ever meet. I'm sure she's in heaven right now. If she didn't go to heaven, well, then I don't know who possibly could. Anyways, I was pretty antsy that night, even with cops guarding the house. And I unfortunately was antsy for a very good reason. When the sun went down, I heard our back door open and close. Was it my parents? I suddenly got very excited, rushing to the door to see them. However, all that was there was one person's muddy footprints on my floor. Something wasn't right. But no one could have gotten into the house, could they? The cops were outside. I rushed upstairs to get Betty. Running into my parents' bedroom, I heard the shower running. Banging on the door, I called to Betty to try and get her attention. No answer. Then, I realized nobody showers with their hearing aid in. Oh no. That's when I heard Nancy scream downstairs. I rushed downstairs, really not wanting to go into her room, but I knew I had to. When I got to her room, yep, you guessed it. She was gone, window flung open. Where the hell were the cops? Taking matters into my own hands, I got my shoes and ran out the door. Running down the street, my eyes adjusted to the darkness just in time to see Nancy entering the forest. The same forest that lies next to the hill upon which the dreaded Hoffmister home sits. I called out to her desperately, but she was in a trance, just like those other kids I had seen. But no one would believe me then. Mustering up every ounce of courage I had, I ran after Nancy as she disappeared into the darkness of the woods. I ran deep into the dark forest, my feet making loud crunching noises on the gravel path beneath me. Catching up to Nancy, I pleaded and begged her to come too. She couldn't snap out of it. I began pulling her away, but she continued to walk deeper into the woods. Then, to make matters worse, I spotted Eileen, who was about 30 to 40 feet down the path from us. I couldn't snap Nancy out of this damn trance. I'll never forget the way her eyes looked, hypnotized and dilated. It reminded me of the trance that the snake, Ka, from the Jungle Book put people in. Out of pure desperation, I reared back and slapped Nancy in the face, finally snapping her out of the trance. She had no idea what the hell was going on, she just knew to run from Eileen. Eileen immediately broke into a run after us. I'd never seen a woman in her 60s run that fast. Faster and faster we ran. We were getting away until Nancy's nightgown got caught on a tree branch. I tugged and tugged at her nightgown, desperately trying to free her. Eileen got closer and closer, snickering sickly under her breath. When Eileen got within about 15 feet of us, Nancy's gown finally tore away from that damn tree branch. We darted to the exit of the woods, rushing out into the street. I looked back over my shoulder just in time to see Eileen turn around and disappear into the darkness of the woods. We looked around on the street, trying to find the police car that was supposed to be guarding our house. When we finally found them, they didn't even realize we were missing. The morons were smoking freaking Cubans instead of guarding our house from kidnappers. Unbelievable. I had never felt so neglected and unprotected in my life. My parents were gone, and now the police weren't even looking after me. The idiotic officers went and got Betty, driving the three of us down to the police station. Finally, a place I'd be safe, right? Trying to explain to the cops that my sister was placed under some kind of voodoo hypnotism spell was like talking to a brick wall. Some cops are so ignorant, not open-minded at all. That's something I don't miss about Earth. People in authority were such douchebags. At least Betty agreed to stay the night there with us. See what I'm talking about? Nicest lady you'd ever meet. At some point, I fell asleep in the police station, and so did Betty and Nancy. What we woke up to was not at all what anyone ever wants to wake up to. Outside of the station, a roar filled the air. The roar was like nothing I had ever heard. That roar sounded like it came straight from the mouth of hell. The screams of policemen filled the air outside as we listened, scared for our lives. It wasn't until the roaring died down and the screaming stopped that we dared look out of the window, and let me say, it wasn't a pleasant sight. Dozens of bodies were just scattered all over the parking lot, and here we were, tucked in a room in the back of the station, helpless. Nancy, Betty, and I crept down the halls of the station, trying to find an exit. We passed an office just in time to get a look at one of the computer monitors, one that had CCTV footage being fed to it. What we saw on the monitor was shocking. Eileen ripping a side door of the station off its hinges. What was even more shocking to her was her face. Her eyes were demonic, her skin rotted and scarred like a zombie. Her teeth looked grotesque, as if she had meth mouth or something. Why the hell did she look like that? Now I know the answer. She was possessed. That sick witch had willingly conjured up a spell to get herself possessed, just to get her hands on us. The witch ripped the door off its hinges, rushing down the hallway towards us. She had us cornered in the office. And Betty, oh God, poor Betty. I couldn't believe my eyes. Eileen just picked Betty up by the throat, taunting her. It wasn't until Betty began to utter the Lord's Prayer that Eileen was sent into a fit of rage, pinning Betty to the wall and tearing her limb from limb. Right in front of Nancy and me, too. Looking back, I can't even believe a 5-year-old girl was forced to watch something so awful. I had never seen anything so terrible. Of course, now I've seen a billion times worse. Well, after Betty was slowly disemboweled, Eileen collected Nancy and me. Leo drove up to the police station, and into the blue truck we went. No neighbor to save us this time. Before I knew it, I was back at the awful place known as the Hofmeister home. No furniture this time, no creepy portraits, no lights on. Just an empty shell of pure evil. Eileen and Leo took us into the living room where they began to bicker with one another. Leo wanted to have his fun with Nancy, but Eileen told him to wait. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I wanted to get up and rip his head off. If only I could have. To this day, I wish I could have beat the hell out of that sick bastard. During this, I started to wonder where David was. Probably meeting the same fate my brothers and their friends did, and my parents. Oh God, please tell me they didn't too. Leo eventually got impatient with Eileen, telling her he was going to get what he wanted for a change. He turned to look at my little sister, precious little Nancy, grinning. "Come here, sunshine," he exclaimed. The rotten creep threw himself upon Nancy. I rushed at him, attempting to stop him. All I accomplished was getting a backhand to the face. When Eileen intervened, telling him he needed to wait, she received a punch to the jaw. Well, that was a horrible idea on Leo's part. Did that moron forget his wife was possessed? Eileen grabbed Leo, picking him up by the back of his neck. Nancy and I took our chance and ran away. Of course, the front door was right in the path of Eileen, so we had to run deeper into the house to find another way out. I looked back over my shoulder just in time to see Eileen begin to bite down hard on her husband's face, chewing it like a dog on a bone. Leo's cries of pain were both horrifying and reassuring to me. He deserved what he got. Nancy and I rushed through the house, desperately trying to find a way out. Why'd that house have to be so big? It was like a maze, and the fact that we could hear Eileen's demonic growling as she desperately tried to relocate us, well, that didn't help either. Finally, we found a window that looked out over the side of the hill. I quickly unlocked it, hearing Eileen's footsteps grow nearer and nearer. There was a screen on the window, and I reared back and threw my hands into it, tearing it. I guided Nancy out, all the while listening to the haunting sounds of Eileen's feet hitting the wood floors. As Nancy jumped out, I yelled at her to run. I didn't have to tell her twice. As I began making my way out of the window, I suddenly felt the claw, of Eileen grab my shoulder. I screamed out, but nobody was coming to help. Eileen picked me up with the strength of an Olympic strongman, carrying me down the hallway and over to the basement. No, please no, I thought. Not the basement. Please, not the basement. Well, basement it was, as Eileen flung open the door and carried me down into the musty cellar. She got to the bottom of the stairs, clutching me in her arms, and flicked a light on. Immediately, a grisly figure was displayed by the dim light of the basement. It was a 7-foot-tall statue of the devil himself, complete with ram horns, ghoulish eyes, saber teeth, forked tail, and hoofed feet. This was what they were bowing down to that night. It must have been. But now it was in the basement. Eileen plopped me down in a wooden chair so that I was face to face with this horrible statue. She tied me down. This time, it really is it, I thought. Eileen then pulled out a black book with some sort of satanic symbol on the front of it. I tried begging and pleading with her, telling her I was sorry for the rumors I spread. I even offered to tell the whole town that I was lying and that the tales were made up. Why did I even bother? Eileen was having none of it. I then began to cry, asking her why she had to kill my brothers and my parents. Once I said this, Eileen developed a confused expression on her face.
"I did what to them?"
she asked in her deep demonic voice. "Did you kill my parents?" I said.
"Patrick,"
said Eileen.
"Lucifer does not want to just see people die. He wants to see them in hell with him."
"What?" I asked in a sheepish tone.
"Why, you could only say your family is more alive now than ever,"
she exclaimed. And that's when the awful truth was revealed. Out from the dark corner of the basement, behind the statue, came my parents, my brothers, their friends, and those kids that I had seen walking into the house. David was also among them, but they walked in a zombie-like manner. When they all stepped into the light, I saw into their pitch-black, possessed eyes. Those horrible eyes were not the eyes of the people I knew. They all looked dirty and abused, and their skin looked like it had begun to decay. Eileen grinned with glee at this sight.
"You see, Patrick,"
she said,
Mommy and Daddy are here. Say hi to Mommy and Daddy.
I looked at my parents, desperately trying to get them to respond to me, but they were gone. It was an awful feeling.
Hail Lucifer,
shouted Eileen.
Hail Lucifer,
repeated the hypnotized people in a monotone zombie fashion. Eileen then looked at me.
And now, you'll join them.
Eileen opened the black book and began reciting incantations. The zombies, the people I once knew, encircled me and began reciting with Eileen. I pleaded with my brothers, with David, with my parents, but it was no use. They were lost. Suddenly, the statue's lifelike lips began to quiver intensely. I thought I was dreaming. It's funny, when something like this happens, all you think to yourself is, holy crap, is this really happening? The statue's eyelids began to quiver as well, before opening to reveal pitch black eyes. The eyes began to glow a vibrant red, just as the statue's jaw began to unhinge. And then, a loud roar erupted from the statue. This roar was even worse than Eileen's demonic roar, louder and much deeper. White mist in the shape of a human skull started to rise up from behind the statue as Eileen shouted in English.
Beastie's hungry.
I screamed a blood-curdling scream as the mist made a beeline for me, shooting straight into my mouth, down my throat. I screamed as I felt the evil spirit make its way into my belly, wriggling around in my insides. My high-pitched scream slowly began to grow deeper and deeper, turning into a demonic roar. This is what it felt like to become possessed. I was Eileen's now, but even worse, I was Lucifer's. The last months of my life were agonizing as I lost myself, lost who I was as a person. I became the evil zombie slave of Eileen Hofmeister, working to serve the devil himself. It was like a dream. I was in control of my actions, but I wasn't at the same time. My slave labor ended when my body began to slowly decay. That was when Eileen disposed of me, likely going on to replace me with another poor child. And that is why I am where I am now. It doesn't make sense to me at all. I don't deserve to be in this place. Sure, I lived out the last moments of my life serving God's adversary, but it wasn't my choice. Why, then, am I here? Some sort of mistake? Did heaven run out of space, or does everyone just go here? Are my parents here too? My brothers? Perhaps that is the worst part. I am not even granted the answers to these questions. I just live in total darkness and extreme heat. Regardless, I know that it's Eileen's fault I'm here. It's all Eileen's fault. It was Eileen who stole me from heaven's true light, and that is why, from hell, I write. Sorry for that. It's just, I used to like to rhyme when I was young. Come on down to Albert's Corn Maze for a hauntingly good time. My name's Albert, and I tell ya, I'm a simple farmer, but I grow the best darn vegetables. People come from all over to buy my produce. It's much better than anything you can get in a store. And now that we're getting into fall weather, I make this corn maze that everyone really loves. People get lost in there for hours. I like to give back to my community, though. I heard they've been having some weird weather over in Myersville. Nothing can get in or out lately, including fresh produce. So I loaded up my old truck to take some over. She's rusty, and I had her forever, but she ain't ever broke down on me yet. I call her All Reliable. Driving through that town was one of the creepiest things I ever saw. Not a single person came up to my truck. They all just sat on their porches and watched me. Real creepy. Every pair of eyes watched me as I drove through town. No kids outside playing, no one else walking down the street or driving. Entire town was all just sat on their porches. And the creepiest part? They all looked melted too. Half their faces hanging off their skulls. Looked like some little kid tried to sculpt the whole town out of Play-Doh. Sent a shiver right up my spine. I thought about bringing my son, Melvin, with me, but this probably would have scared the pants right off him, if he wore pants. So I turned around and drove on home. I didn't sell anything, but that's alright. I'm sure someone will buy them right up when I open that corn maze. It's almost done, and I tell ya, Melvin sure loves running around in that thing. Stays in there for hours, sometimes days. I don't worry about him though. He's a silly boy, but he's alright. I made him myself. I asked the missus for help, but she told me it wasn't right. He probably would have turned out better if the missus had stuck around, but there was a small mishap. Anyway, he's a little twiggish. Mostly because he's made of twigs and vines and stuff. And he got this big head like a Venus flytrap. See, this weird fella came rolling through and saw my farm and stopped to say hi. He said I had some of the best produce he ever saw, and said he could sell me something to help him grow even better. I thought it sounded a lot like nonsense, but the missus said we should give him a chance. She was also so kind and generous, and it's why I married her. I hope she passed all that on to Melvin in their short time together. Anyway, this weird little guy said if we bought his fertilizer recipe, he'd throw in some rare seeds too. Said we'd have to fertilize it according to his recipe though, but it was a guaranteed success. Mrs. was on board with it till she found out what goes into the fertilizer. As weird as that guy was, he was certainly onto something. Said it would double, maybe even triple my profits, and by golly, he was right. He didn't leave any contact information, or I would have passed it on to some of the other local businesses here. So anyway, I planted those seeds and followed the instructions. All the seeds died except one. I named him Melvin, because it sounds like a smart name. Mrs. fainted when she met Melvin. I guess she was just so overcome with happiness. I know I was. And Melvin's real smart, too. He's still getting the hang of talking. He mostly just squeaks and chirps, but I can usually understand him. I'm trying to get him to help me finish up the corn maze. He sure loves testing it out. It's almost done, though. If I can push through the night, I can probably finish it tomorrow morning and open it for business. I know people sure do love that pumpkin spice stuff. When morning came, I set up some signs advertising produce and hot chocolate in the corn maze. Although I thought it was a little too warm for hot chocolate, but people still buy the stuff anyway. I asked Melvin for help cleaning up a bit, but he just did his weird little high-pitched giggle and ran off into the corn maze. Surprisingly, people started arriving during the afternoon. I think it was still too bright outside for people to do the corn maze, so most of them just bought produce. I sell a lot of corn and a lot of tomatoes. Probably would have sold some more pumpkins, but they're not quite ready yet. A few people asked what the trick was to getting such big vegetables packed with so much flavor, but I just tell them it's a trade secret. When night started to fall, the most obnoxious group of kids showed up. Bunch of, what do the kids call them, meatheads, jocks. They had some real pretty girls with them, though. One of them was dressed in real tiny shorts, and she had just the prettiest hair I had ever seen. Mrs. always yelled at me for staring at the younger women, but I couldn't help myself. I know they dress like this on purpose. Her meathead friends were busy fooling around and punching each other. I could smell alcohol on them. I told her she might get cold later, just like that, but she just sneered at me. I know it's all just an act, though. Women dress all revealing like this on purpose and then feign repulsion when a fella like me shows an interest in them. Then they squeal about it with their friends, but secretly, they like the attention. But sure enough, when the sun set and the air started to cool, she started complaining she was cold and she wanted to go home. Her friends were too busy still fooling around, though. They had another friend with them, but she wasn't nearly as pretty as this one. She was just alright to look at. She suggested that they get some hot chocolate. After I handed them the cups, I saw them walk a few steps away and add something else to the cocoa from a flask. I guess that worked, because soon after that, she stopped complaining, and two of them were dancing along to music. The one girl danced like a spastic fish out of water, but the pretty one, she sure knew how to twist and move, and I got a real nice view of her. "Hey, y'all should try the corn maze," I called over to them. She just scoffed, but the meatheads really got into the idea. "Yeah, let's do it," they cheered, falling over each other. "Is it even any good? I mean, this place is kind of a dump," she said. She was clearly trying to play the not interested game. The missus had tried that when I first tried taking her out, but you can see how that worked out for her. "Well, sure," I said, and coolly as I could. There's people still in there, and it's a lot warmer. The corn is a good insulator. I winked at her. They paid up and headed inside. Wasn't long before we started hearing shrieks and giggles from the maze. I switched the radio to play some music from a Halloween disc I bought a few years ago. The sounds from the corn maze blended right in with the music. Then I started hearing Melvin's giggles, followed by some screaming. I frowned, because Melvin wasn't supposed to be in the maze when we had customers. I headed inside. The air was cool, as a crisp breeze whispered through the rows and rows of corn. The dirt ground crunched beneath my boots. All was eerily silent, except for the muffled music and the occasional rustle from the corn. To the untrained person, the maze can be a real labyrinth, but since I'm the one who made it, I knew that thing like the back of my hand. I was surprised to see Melvin had done some decorating, though. I turned left, right, left, until I came to an intersection where the path split in every direction. At one dead end, he had managed to move one of my scarecrows and fit its head with an old rusty bear trap I had lying around. At another dead end was a string of little makeshift straw dolls. That boy is so creative. I was so proud of him. I continued on. When the ground under my feet started squishing and squelching, I knew something wasn't right. I followed the squishy path to a specifically long and winding dead end. At the end, Melvin had placed a couple of hay bales in case anyone needed to stop and take a rest. That boy is so darn considerate. And sure enough, one of the meatheads had stopped to take a load off. Except in the dim light, I could see he was slick with blood. His guts spilled out onto his lap, and all his teeth had been pulled out and scattered around him. At the very least, he would make a convincing decoration for the time being. I headed deeper into the maze. Right, left, straight, left. I had really outdone myself this year with the maze. There were plenty of dead turns for people to get stuck. A few people who had made it through told me it was one of the most difficult mazes they had ever been through. The next dead end I found ended abruptly. A deep trench had been dug, and several fence posts had been sharpened and stuck in the ground. The less pretty girl was impaled up on these posts, one sharp end poked right through her stomach. Her face was frozen with horror, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a scream, but just blood trickled out. "Melvin," I called out. "Where are you, boy?" But he didn't answer. Instead, a sharp scream cut through the eerie night. I followed it until I found the pretty girl and the other meathead. Deep lacerations covered his body and blood pooled underneath him. The girl was on the ground next to him, breathing heavily. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Help me!" she screamed at me when she saw me. She sure was in pretty bad shape. One of her feet was cut almost clean off. Her long legs were stained with blood and bite marks. "Now what's all this here?" I asked. "What kind of sick freak show are you putting on here?" she yelled at me. I didn't answer, but a rustling in the corn next to me caused her to gasp. She started to drag her body away from it, her foot dragging behind her, limp and useless. Melvin emerged from the corn, chittering and chirping like he always does. "Melvin, what have you gotten yourself into, boy?" I asked him. He just looked at me and cocked his head to the side. He opened his mouth in a makeshift smile, revealing his sharp teeth. His mouth dripped blood and bits of flesh were stuck in his teeth. He squeaked and took another step towards the girl. The rest of his viney body was also stained with blood. "I bet you just wanted to help your old man, eh?" I asked him. The girl lay between us, looking back and forth, unsure of what to do. Melvin chirped again. I grinned at him. "All right, now let's get you out of here," I said to the girl as I picked her up and slung her over my shoulder. "Oh, thank you so much," she gushed. I guess this is what it took to get a pretty girl to be nice to you. "Wait, where are you going?" I moved deeper into the corn maze, and she started trying to hit and kick me with her good foot. Nestled right at the edge of the cornfield was my old work shed. I kept a bunch of old rusty tools in there, some seeds and other equipment. I pulled a key out of my pocket and unlocked the door. Inside, it was rank with unpleasant smells, but you got used to it after a while. Melvin trotted in behind me, eager to help. "Hey, what are you doing? Where are we?" the girl shrieked, starting to hit me again. I flung her down on a work table, probably harder than I should have. She whimpered when she landed, and then scrambled to get away from Melvin when he ran up to look at her. He snapped and growled at her. "What the hell is that?" she asked, pointing at something behind me. I turned to see what she was pointing at. "Oh, that's the missus. She likes to watch me work." She was referencing a severely rotted, severed head that sat on top of a tool chest in the corner of the shed. I admit it was pretty nasty, but I just couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. And I like looking at her every day. "Now let's get to work," I said, pulling out a small hatchet. The bodies tonight would help fertilize my crops for months. Out in the woods. When I was a child, it was just me and my mother. We lived in a property owned by my grandma, a 3-story old farmhouse right at the fringe of the woods. It was far off the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt very isolated at night, being so distant from any of the other houses, set in an area that hadn't been inhabited for 30 years before we started living in it. Quite often, I was a fairly rambunctious child, so while my mom went off to work, I would occasionally skip the morning bus to school and stay home alone all day. The big house had a habit of feeling incredibly lonely and sparse, so I spent most of my time playing in the forest expanse out back. Some distance into the woods, far enough that I couldn't hear my mother when she called, there was a toppled pine tree which had crashed into another. An even larger trunk on its way down was now frozen there, forming a long arc over the forest floor. I loved to climb up the jagged stump at the base of this fallen tree, and then steady myself to a point just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way to the top, just because it got too steep for me to continue any farther, and I had a bad habit of freaking out from how high up I was. One day, I was sitting in my usual spot on the fallen tree, which was a good distance from the ground, just listening to the birds singing and simultaneously feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck, when I heard something strange from underneath that paralyzed me in shock. "Hey, kid." I was gripped by a sudden strong urge of fear for a moment. The voice had come from directly underneath me. I strained to look down, but couldn't see anything over the ledge. For a long time, I just sat there in absolute silence, and I was at the point where I was almost soon to convince myself that I had imagined hearing a man's voice at all. "I know you can hear me." His voice was much louder this time, as I yelled something out and scrambled up the log a bit higher. Trembling nervously, I dug my fingernails into the bark and held tight for dear life. I sat there, trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long. Although I couldn't see it, the presence of the thing underneath me was still clear. The bird song was much softer and more cautious this time, and when I listened closely, I swear I could hear the faintest echo of human breathing. Gathering all my courage, I vowed to prove to myself that it was all my imagination by leaning over the ledge as far as I possibly could without slipping right off. Digging hard into the bark behind me, I stretched out along my arms and peered over, getting a full view of the empty forest floor and overgrowth when suddenly, "Come down here or I'll come up and grab you." It was so loud, it was as if it was being screamed right in my face. I released my grip on the tree in fright and plunged off the platform. I was saved only by grabbing a nearby branch, and for one awful second, my bare legs dangled in the cool air. When I pulled myself up, I ran at full speed to the top of the collapsed pine, to the point I had never reached before. I sat there, just below the rustling canopy, pissing myself and staring at the distant base where the splintered wood rose, fully expecting at any moment to see someone crawling rapidly up the pine towards me. Instead, all I heard was the wind whistling in the leaves above and below me, and occasional snippets of birdsong. It was about 2 hours before my mother got home and found me, after much worried searching, trembling, and crying at the top of a fallen tree. Although this incident spooked both me and my mother, in time I somehow recovered, exhibiting that naive hard skin of a child, although I never went as far into the forest as I used to, and never again even approached that fallen tree. Once when I was 12, I had the chore of taking firewood from the shed out back, just at the edge of the woods, and to bring it back inside the house. It was a tiresome job, and I always chose to do it at dusk when the air was brimming with mosquitoes and a swampy fog that usually coated the lawn. By the time I had made my last round, I would sprint back to the house, spooked. One of my least favorite things about this job was that the shed was full of barn owls. If you've ever seen a barn owl's face staring at you from a dark roof corner, then you will know how uncomfortable that shed made me. One of those nights, it got mistier than it ever had before. A thick silver fog covered everything and limited my line of sight to a short sphere around me. Even though the shed wasn't far from the house, I found myself feeling disoriented, and more than once I walked in the wrong direction, both times for some reason walking straight into the woods. By the time I had reached my last load, it was too foggy to see the street. My eyes stung in the moisture, and it made my vision blur. Lurching forward, I managed to walk headfirst into a tree, doubling over and dropping all the wood I was bundling onto my feet with a hard crunch. As I went to pick them up, with my foot throbbing pretty hard, I realized that the ground was too misty for me to see my own knees. I decided to head up to the house, since we had more than enough wood for one night. However, it was getting to be pretty dark, and I couldn't make out any signifiers of which direction I was heading in. Even though I cautiously walked for several feet in all directions, trying to figure out my position in the mists, I still couldn't figure out any point of identification. I couldn't even locate the fence or the gate, and the more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into trees, pine needles, and mud crunching under my feet instead of dew-covered lawn. After a while, I finally realized that I couldn't even find the shed anymore. Cursing myself for being so dumb, while trying to ignore my thumping heart and sense that something else was at play, I became aware that I was lost somewhere in the fringe of the forest. Screaming out for my mother at the loudest possible volume was only met with a resounding silence from the depths of the mist all around from where I stood, affirming that I had wandered too far from the house to be heard. As the deep panic started to settle on me, I noticed a glimpse of something pink moving against a nearby pine trunk. Coming closer, I saw that it was a ripped-out square of pink paper. On it, there was an arrow pointing left. Looks vaguely like something my mom might make, I rationalized, to keep me from getting lost. So foolishly, I followed the direction set by that green arrow, shivering in the increased cold. I kept walking for about 5 to 10 minutes before needing to stop to take a breath. My heart was pounding so fast it was beginning to hurt. As I was sitting down, however, I spied what appeared to be another note fluttering on a nearby trunk. I noticed that this one was embedded with a long nail. It bore another arrow, this one pointing up, and a small, sloppily written note that said, "This way." Despite my increasing panic, I convinced myself that these notes were my only shot at getting back before nightfall. I was desperate to get the hell out, and my brow was cold with sweat. So I followed the green arrow to a point where I could just dimly make out another spot of pink, up an incline of collapsed stumps and leaf litter. At this point, it was getting pretty dark, and I had to strain both my eyes just to see a few meters ahead of me. Following the green arrows, feeling less and less sure of where I was, I stumbled through the woods, groping out in the mist to feel for trees, although I was terrified of something unseen grabbing my arm. I came across the third green note, which had another arrow pointing up again. This one led to an increasingly steep slope that I didn't recognize being anywhere near my house, and with a poorly drawn smiley face right above it. At this stage, I became too freaked to cope and started to cry there a little. As I slumped against the pine stump, the possibility that I would be out in these woods all night was beginning to sink in, like a syringe being driven into the veins within my arm. I caught a glimpse of another pink square in the near distance. Squinting hard, unnerved by these notes, all of which looked fresh and without any sign of decay despite the previous week's nonstop rain, I read it from afar. What I read made my blood turn cold. I stood to my knees, dead silently, wobbling on them in fear. My ears were sensitive to any tiny prickle of noise in the mist. For a long time, I stood there in the rolling fog, reading and rereading a horrible note over and over again, before a snapping stick somewhere behind me caused me to sprint, blindly, twigs snagging at my ankles and cutting up my face as I ran. Written on the note, in big green letters, was my name. It felt like I was running for hours. All the while, the rain and mist lapped at the back of my neck like the decaying breath of someone running right behind me. Somehow, I made it back to the house. All the lights were off, and I struggled to find the keys for a moment. When I found them, I bolted indoors and quickly crawled into bed where I remained, unsleeping till morning. Mom just thought I'd come inside and gone to bed, and hadn't thought to leave the lights on. It was a miracle, aka some freakish coincidence, that I even found the house at all. The final incident at that damn house was witnessed only by my mother. Up until then, she had never experienced any of the strange things as I had, although we mutually shared the peculiar oppressive quality that the house's interior had on us and its placement in the dreary, imposing woods. Although I was obviously never a popular kid by living way out in the country in the opposite direction from everyone else at my school, I did make some tight friends in my first year of high school. One of these friends, Amanda was her name, invited me over one night and I accepted. My mother drove me out to the place, which was about 3 miles away, then drove back home. The night went well. We watched a horror movie, suitably, devoured some pizza, and probably smoked a little pot. My mother went home alone where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at that point. It was about midnight when I received an off-putting text from Mom in all caps. "Is this a prank? I need to know immediately." Thinking it was some kind of joke, I texted back, "Calm yourself, is what a prank?" Almost immediately the response, "Are you at the house?" Of course I responded no, though I was thoroughly weirded out. I didn't receive another message until around 3 a.m. when she told me to go to Grandma's in the morning and to not by any means dare to go home. I remember those bleak torrents of rain the day I went to my grandmother's, and how terribly soaked I was when I finally got there. It was nearly 2 towns away. I'd had to fight the temptation to go home and drop off my bags, but Mom's disturbing messages from last night were enough of a warning not to do so. When I arrived, Mom and Grandma were having lunch. At first, my mother seemed to be in some sort of composed state, but when I got a better look at her, I noticed that all the color had drained from her face and she was slightly trembling. At one point, she even sent a small glass crashing to the floor after flinching at the cat brushing around her ankles. It wasn't until later that night, when my grandma was sound asleep, that she told me what happened. She went further as to forbid me from telling old grandma, out of fear that it would horrify her superstitious soul too much. This was what happened the night before when I was at Amanda's, as she described in lurid detail. My mother was sitting on the first story in the living room, where she sat on the couch by the fire, curtains open to the view of the sunset on the canopy, going over her latest draft. At first, it was so faint that she barely noticed it, but after a while, my mother became aware of, and vaguely irritated by, tiny thumping noises near her head, at the window. When she went over to investigate, she saw fat brown moths of a kind we often got at that place, buzzing madly into the glass. Realizing that this was the cause of the sound, she returned to her work, however, feeling rattled in some way. It was when the noises started to get sharper and louder that she paid more attention and saw that rocks were being thrown at the window from the total blackness of the forest edge. She saw them appear from the shadows of the brush and then fall in an arc and bounce off the window. Looking carefully, she could see small cracks from where some heavy ones had hit, right beside where her head had been moments before. Temporarily captivated, she tried to peer into the darkness enough to make out where the rocks were being thrown from. Then, with a startled shock, she jumped back from the window as she saw me standing half behind a tree right near the window, grinning wide and staring at her, my one visible eye stretched wide open, showing all white. She barely stifled a scream, seeing her own daughter standing there, just staring and smiling. Not only did the figure not move or blink, it was standing by one of the nearest pines, far from where the rocks were shooting up out of the brush, as they continued to do so in a loud downpour. My face unceasingly continued to press out at her, smiling. Thinking this was all some kind of sick prank, hence the later text, my mother shouted my name at the top of her lungs, frightened to the core. However, instead of responding, the mouth of the thing, that looked like me, behind the tree just started moving as if it were mouthing words silently, really, really fast. Suddenly, it turned its head to the side and seemed to be talking to someone else behind the tree, my mom said, who couldn't be seen. But she could see a formless black shape hanging against the other side of the tree. The girl that looked like me kept staring at my mother and doing the silent speed-talking thing, then turning and whispering to the thing next to her. Then she would turn back and start up again. Then, breaking the monotonous spell, she suddenly pointed straight at my mother and started laughing. My mother screamed and fled to my bedroom on the second story, the only room with a working lock, where she shut herself in and sat at the far end of the bed as the rocks began to pitter-patter against the window downstairs, dry heaving and weeping in fear. In my room, my mother said she did not feel safe. There was an awful smell and a weird humming noise in the walls, as she described. She tried to pray for a time before giving up and just listening to the rocks pelt the walls and windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, she caught the distinct vibrant sound of a window actually smashing, and the weird continuous humming. Listening more carefully, she could identify it as the softest hint of a mumbling voice. In an absolute horror, she recognized the voice, and then, virtually too afraid to look, she tilted her head up to the closet door where an awful white face could be seen staring right at her, mouth contorting and gaping in what sounded like highly sped up whispering. The closet door was only a meter from my mother. It started to open slowly. In an unimaginable explosion of terror, she immediately bolted to the door, only to fumble with the lock as bigger and bigger rocks came crashing through the window, which burst apart in a spray of glass shards before finally getting out, running out of the house, completely keeping her eyes off the woods, getting into the car, and driving off. She said that as she glanced back, right at the end of the prolonged drive, she saw two unmistakable human forms standing at my broken bedroom window, watching as her car got farther and farther away from our house. This would be their final farewell, as my mother never stepped foot in that place again. As my mother told this story, she broke down into tears. I didn't doubt her, and I still don't. I honestly and fully believe that she experienced what she says she did. It was also quite clear that we were done living in that house for once and for all. I only went back once, with my dad, who I see very rarely now. He came from another state to help us move. Mom had already found a place in town and moved in. My dad and I just loaded up his truck with all that was left inside there. It was a silent, sunny morning when we removed all the stuff and emptied the place. I wish I could say there was some closure, some final spooking to cap it all off, but there wasn't. It was just a relief to be out of there. There are, however, only two things left worth mentioning. Number one, when we checked the house for any signs of intruders, we found that several windows, including one in my bedroom and the kitchen, had been smashed and rocks were lying on the floor. Number two, Dad went out into the trees for a bit to take a leak. When he came back, he asked how long we'd had the swing set for. Needless to say, we'd never had a swing set, so I was fairly unsettled to discover that in the week since we'd been gone, someone had assembled a rope swing set from one of our highest branches of the old pine over the ridge, against which was the fallen log I'd stopped climbing many years ago. It was obviously new rope, and a nicely polished, sanded down wooden seat at the base. Dad, wanting to keep my mind from recent events, he doubted the affair and thought my mother was mentally unstable, said that a neighbor probably set it up, not realizing it was on our property. Of course, he knew as well as I did that we literally had no neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. There were no houses in all that space, and never in my time living there did I ever see any other signs of human habitation. But I let it all go, and was pleased enough just to say good riddance to that horrible place as we drove off for good. For the most part, I've found it best to try and forget what happened at that place. Sometimes I just can't help but ponder it, though. It's been long enough now that I no longer feel scared talking about it, but for a long while I couldn't. Seeing as it is Halloween, what better time to share? My grandma just recently sold the house to a new family, that being a young couple and their little son, shortly after we moved out, despite my mother's desperate insistence that it be left empty. Now she refuses to talk about what happened altogether. I'm less anxious about it, although sometimes I can't help but let my imagination get the better of me. All I can do is think of that old house, the fallen down tree, the new occupants, and the swing out back, gently spinning in the breeze as that little boy toddles obliviously towards it. My haunted house. I had what many people would call a warped childhood. Many children are raised on nursery rhymes, fairy tales, and Dr. Seuss. And while my childhood did have these memories, my mother included another genre in mine and my sister's upbringing: horror. I cannot count the number of times when my sister and I were read some of Stephen King's short stories for bedtime rather than a more common children's story. Popsy was always my favorite. I grew up watching the classic horror movies and being told ghost stories. Many people, when I tell this to them, ask me if I had a lot of nightmares as a child as a result. But the truth is quite the opposite. I was not afraid of boogeymen or ghosts. To me, ghosts and goblins were simply fictional characters that are only in books, movies, and in stories told around the campfire. The horror genre was simply a part of my life. I loved the feeling of being scared. So, naturally, Halloween was one of my favorite times of the year. I remember one Halloween many years ago. I was young, but not so young that I don't have first-hand memories of the events soon to follow. There was a Halloween attraction that was running just down the street from our house. It had been going on every Halloween for a few years, but my parents had never let my sister and I go before. And then, one year, we were finally given permission to go to this haunted attraction. The attraction was built into an old and abandoned manor house, just the sort of place where you would expect a Halloween attraction to be built. I remember being very excited as I waited to get into the house because lots of people that were coming out were raving about how scary it was, and I was highly anticipating having my own time inside. Like most Halloween attractions, they let the people inside the house in small groups. Because my sister and I were only children, the attendants at the door made sure that we were put in the same group as our parents. Finally, we stepped inside. Inside, it could have been any haunted house in America in the 90s, full of fake fog and grease-painted actors. I wasn't overly scared because my mother always reminded me that the actors are not allowed to touch you. But I jumped and screamed along with everyone else when a monster jumped out of the hidden nooks and crannies of the old manor house. Eventually, we made our way down into the basement, which had been changed into the stereotypical mad doctor setting common in a lot of haunted houses. Needless to say, there was a lot of fake blood everywhere. But I'll never forget that basement because something just seemed a little out of place. Sometimes even the most normal things can become diabolical if you alter the perspective. It's something you see in a few modern ghost hunting shows and B-shots. There was nothing that immediately jumped out as being evil. There was certainly nothing like The Exorcist happening to tip me off that something was wrong. It was a simple sight, but that made it much more unnerving because it stood out against the overt horror backdrop of the decorated room. In the midst of the bloody carnage of the Mad Doctor's operating room, I remembered that an old woman was sitting in the far corner of the room. She looked to be in her 80s, had thinning gray hair, and was very thin. I would be lying to myself if I said that she didn't scare me more than the rest of the attraction combined. At the time, I didn't have much understanding of the effects the different physical ailments can have on a person, but looking back now, I would say that she was the victim of a bad stroke. Sometimes a bad stroke will leave the person with one side of his or her face paralyzed, and that's exactly what had happened to her. One side of her face was drooping, and saliva was leaking from the corner of her drooped mouth. She was talking, yelling at us as we passed by. Her words were badly slurred because of her paralyzed face, but I could make out what she was yelling. "Stop! Get out!" over and over again. Even passing through the basement and going out the other side, I could still hear her screaming in that awful slurred way up the stairs. I was extremely disturbed by the sight of the old woman, but as I got away from her, I began to feel better. She was obviously an actor who was working for the attraction. Most of the attraction worked on jump scares, and she was obviously there to cater more to psychological horror. Well, in any case, it worked. It certainly worked on me. We emerged into the night once again and got that instant sense of relief that makes horror so addicting. The "we have survived" moment. My sister instantly began to talk about which part was her favorite. An actor who jumped out at her in a werewolf costume had been her favorite. When it came my turn to share, I could think of nothing besides the old woman I'd seen, and I told my family about how the old woman in the basement had scared me the most. "What woman in the basement, Ashley?" my mother asked. Shocked, I began to describe as well as I could what I'd seen. When I had finished, my mother said that she hadn't seen any woman fitting that description down in the basement. The rest of the family agreed with her. I put the incident out of my mind. Like I said, I didn't believe in ghosts and didn't believe they were real. I tried to rationalize why they had missed the old woman and her screams. Each attempt to do this was more pathetic than the last, but I knew that ghosts couldn't be real. The next year, I was eager to step foot in the old manor again, but I was horrified to discover that the haunted attraction had been shut down and would not be opening again. Since I lived so close to the haunt, a few people in my neighborhood had taken up jobs there, and I asked around with them about why it had closed. The few people that would talk to me told me that the old manor house was really haunted, with real ghosts, and that too many people were refusing to work there again because of the paranormal activity going on there. Their stories ranged from objects moving on their own to apparitions and even to physical attacks against the living that entered certain parts of the house. I laughed it off. People were just letting the atmosphere of the Halloween haunt mess with them. It was probably just a couple of pranksters messing with the workers. But no matter how much I tried to explain to the workers about how it could be a couple of jokers messing around, they kept insisting that it was impossible for it to have been any human activity. But even as I tried to convince them, I couldn't help but remember the old woman that I had seen in the basement that no one else had seen. I was kind of nervous about the whole thing, and I wanted more information about the house. These days, you can look anything up on the internet and have an answer in seconds, but the 90s was not like that. Few people had internet at the time, and my family was one that did not have internet access, so I went to the next best thing, my mother. I asked her about the old manor house. At first she was reluctant to tell me, which unnerved me more than anything because she had never shied away from telling us things of that nature before. Finally, she told me what she knew. The manor started out as a private residence built in 1922, but the original owner lost the house in foreclosure. After that, it became a sanatorium, which is something like a small hospital. Just by virtue of being a hospital in an area where it was the only hospital around at the time, a lot of people passed away within the walls. In fact, there are some reports to say that there was at least one death a day within those walls during this time. But that was not even the part that my mother was reluctant to tell me. She told me that afterward it was turned into a nursing facility, and they would have taken care of sick older people just like the old woman I had seen during my walk through. But the records of abuse that came out of that place is numerous. Many ex-employees confessed that they quit soon after being hired because of the vast amount of malpractice that happened there. My mother remembered all this because it was in the newspapers when it was going on and was a huge deal in the community. It made me feel a little sick to think about how those people, those human beings, were treated in that horrible place. And that's not all. Local legend has long said that the building was haunted by the tortured souls of the people who died under the horrible conditions there. The man who built the Halloween attraction there knew the history and the legends surrounding the place and built the attraction with the sole purpose of playing off those stories. It was then that I knew that I had seen the ghost of a woman who had died in the building. She just wanted to spend her afterlife in peace, but instead, every year, she and her fellow ghosts were interrupted by the living, storming through their place in the thousands, turning their situation into a joke. And for the first time ever, I began to treat ghosts and spirits not as fictional characters only meant to frighten and scare, but as a real physical manifestation of a force that humans are not capable of understanding yet. The house, to this day, continues to be a hotspot for paranormal activity. The owner lets in a local paranormal group at least once a week, every Friday night, to do an investigation. Several ghost-themed television shows have filmed at the location. One show brought in a psychic medium who claims that the years the house spent as a Halloween attraction has forever scarred the house and the spirits who reside there. One thing is for sure, I'm now a lot more careful about checking out the history of any Halloween haunt I go to. Ghosts are everywhere, of course, but I'll never go into a place with such a sad history attached to it. And I haven't been able to get scared inside a Halloween attraction since. I don't scream, jump, or run away as the actors jump out at me. Nearly all my friends have commented on my bravery in the face of these Halloween attractions. But I'm not brave, not really. It's just a lack of fear. Because it's hard to get scared by actors in makeup when you've been inside the real thing. Please take just one. I was 13 years old when I stopped trick-or-treating. The other kids weren't so eager to give up free candy, but something happened that year. Something awful. My friends, Owen, Drew, and I were out trekking for candy when we came to a house that had a big bowl of it sitting on the porch. A sign above it read, "Please take just one." We joked about swiping it all, but Owen and Drew only took a few each, enough to make them feel like badass kids. I'd always been afraid to take more than one because I was intimidated by authority. Sure, it was just a sign, and it usually meant that the owner wasn't home, but I was a timid kid who always did what he was told. Owen and Drew explained how that house did the same thing every year, and that people rarely saw the guy who lived there. They dared me what they were too chicken to do, so I decided to see what it felt like to do something naughty. We looked around to make sure no one was watching, and I poured the contents of the bowl into my bag. The three of us ran down the street, laughing and shoving each other. Part of me expected someone to chase after us. In hindsight, I was right to be concerned. At Owen's house, we dumped out and sorted all of our yummy treasures. I tried to offer him and Drew some of the contraband candy, but they refused. I remember Owen saying, "That's all you, dude," and Drew shouting, "I don't want your tainted treats." Granted, they weren't entirely serious, but I was annoyed that they weren't sharing in the responsibility, enough to go home instead of sleeping over. That night, I was torn from a sugar-fueled dream by a hand over my mouth and a knife to my neck. The skin was rough and the blade was ice cold. It was just slightly pressing into my skin, ready to slit my throat at a moment's notice. My body went stiff. I wanted to scream, but then a gruff voice whispered, "Don't make a fucking sound." At first, I didn't realize what was happening. Were we being burglarized? Then I got my answer. "Can't you read, you little shit? The sign says just one. Just fucking one." I'll never forget those words and the sickening smell of his breath. He went on to explain how every year he would catch kids taking 2 or 3 pieces of candy, which always infuriated him. It wasn't until I took the entire bowl that he finally snapped. Why did I do something so stupid? I was terrified and humiliated at the same time.
"You like candy, you little shit?" he asked me, so I shook my head as much as I could, despite his hand pressing against my face. He then removed it, still holding the knife to my neck, and proceeded to shove unwrapped candy into my mouth. I tried not to inhale, but I couldn't help it. I could feel things pushing against the back of my throat as I whimpered and drooled. I started to gag, but he put his hand back over my mouth so I wouldn't cough anything up. I truly believed I was going to die, and I feared for my friends as well. My short life flashed quickly before my eyes. All I could think in that moment was, how could an adult hate children this much? Everything I presumed about them was suddenly a lie. They weren't infallible, and their authority wasn't always law. Fine, so I took all this guy's candy. Did I really deserve to die? As I contemplated this for the first time, expecting to suffocate to death, my father rushed into the room, grabbed my metal desk chair, and beat the living daylights out of the guy. I never loved my dad so much as I did that night. I'm an adult now, and I live alone in a nice house on a quiet street with lots of kids. Every Halloween, I leave a basket on my front stoop full of candy with a sign that reads, "Take as many as you want."